Woodcraft since 1928, providing traditional and modern woodworking tools and supplies to generations of craftsmen. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Hello, come on in. My name is Rick Butz. Welcome to wood carving. I'm whittling a loon head right now. And let me show you what we're going to be doing here. This is our carving of an Adirondack Loon. It's a large water-dwelling bird that lives on the freshwater lakes. It's a lot different than a duck because the tail comes right down to the water and his beak is kind of a spear point. In doing the head here, I can work it out with just a knife. But for doing the rest of the body, this is really too large to do with a knife, so I'll be using the carving gouge to make this. Let me just show you how we get this guy started. First, we need a couple of large pieces of wood. Now, you could make this out of one large block, but the problem is when you're working with a large chunk of wood and you start carving a lot away, you relieve some internal stresses in the wood, and it's more prone to checking and splitting and cracking. So I've got two pieces of 2-inch wood here, and I'm going to laminate up, and that's what we're going to use for the body. The trick in laying out this wood is to make sure that your wood grain goes the same way. First of all, you'll want to make sure that the pieces of the board, this was cut like so, you want to make sure that you line them up so that the grain is going the same way on both of these. You don't want to take a piece with the grain going this way and then put the other piece, the grain going across it, on there. Otherwise, when you go to carving, it'll be all mixed up. The other thing that's important to remember is to take a look at the annual rings. These are the growth rings on the end of the board. And you can count them and see how old your piece of wood is. Now, these rings have a tendency, if the board is going to warp, they sort of straighten. So this board would tend to cup out like this, which it has just a little bit. Now, when you're gluing these up, you want to make sure that these rings all kind of run parallel to each other. If you accidentally switch these around, and so they're going in different directions, when these boards warp, as you can see here, they're going to start pulling apart, and that's going to cause your carving to split. For cutting this out, I'm going to use a bandsaw. And what I've done first is I've taken my pattern and traced it around the piece here. And I'll glue up 2 of those, and then we'll do the profile, and last of all, we'll do the head. By making the head separately, we don't have to have a lot of wood here that's wasted. These patterns are ones that I drew from watching loons near where I live. There's a lake back in my cabin about a mile or so, and I could go back there and study them and watch them. If you're interested in using the patterns, I've included them in a wood carving book that I wrote too, and you're welcome to use those. The bandsaw is kind of a handy little tool to use. It's got 2 large pulleys, one up here and one down here that's powered by an electric motor. Around these 2 pulleys runs a continuous saw blade. And it makes it a very safe tool to use because it's all enclosed. There's only just a few inches that's actually exposed. I'll start that up. The only thing you have to remember is to keep your hands away from the cutting edge, keep your sleeves rolled up, and there's no problem. And that's all there is to it. I don't normally like using power tools because there's a lot of noise and dust and it kind of is a bother. But that bandsaw is about one of the most handiest, useful tools you can use as a wood carver. You can shape away a lot of wood quickly. Now I've got another one here that I cut out. And these guys will rest together like this. Now for gluing this up, just take some Elmer's glue or some Titebond, a water-based casein glue, and then just smear this liberally over both sides. Get it on nice and thick. Then put these together, make sure you have them lined up the way you want them, and grab a couple of clamps. Let's see if we can get this around there. These are called Jorgensen clamps, and it's a variation on an old wooden design where they used to have wooden screws in it instead of the metal ones. The metal ones are a lot better. They don't break off quite as easily as the old wooden ones. And that's our loon blank cut up, or all cut out and glued together. Let this glue sit up for several hours. Overnight works the best. Put this guy aside. Now last night I glued up another piece so we could have it ready to use. And this is our loon blank. This is the outline of the profile of the loon that I've drawn on there. And this wood is white pine, which is a traditional wood that was often used for making decoys. Let me get this guy aside here. Now, how do we hold this? Well, we use our gouges to cut it. And as you can see, because of the irregular shape here, it's not going to fit in the vise very well. It'll be moving around. The best way I found is take a piece of hardwood, like this oak. You can see I've drilled a couple of holes through it. Then I have a large wood screw. That fits down inside, and we'll screw that right in there. Now I'll fit that in my vise. Let's see. Make sure you have something sturdy to fasten this guy down in. With a wooden block in there, you can even fit that in an old metal vise, and it works pretty well. I'm going to be starting out just carving around the neck here, and I'm using a number 9 gouge that's 15 millimeters wide. Now a number 9 is a gouge with a fair amount of curvature to it. And the 9 refers to the sweep number, which just gives you an idea how much curve there is. You don't have to worry about being real neat at this stage. Just rough away the wood. Turn this guy around here. Come down the other side. Now, I'm not doing anything to round the carving at this point. I'm just shaping the rough outline of the profile, but I haven't done anything to round it yet. I find it's easier to work this general profile shape first and then do the rounding. We're doing the tail, we'll just take and do the same thing here. I think I'm going to turn this just a bit. That'll take some of the pressure off that vise when I'm pounding away here. See, it doesn't take a lot of time to start removing big chunks of wood. I'm going to use a little smaller gouge. Now this is a number 5. And this doesn't have as much of a curve as the large one I was just using. And that's because I'm going to be doing a little bit finer here. Now, one of the things is, remember we talked about working with a grain. And we said that if you go against the grain, you can cause the wood to split. On a project like this, we can use that to our advantage. Because now if going here, the tool starts to dig in. Okay, if I'm lucky, I can take and split out a large piece of that, and that'll cut my time down a little bit. See, just a couple of whacks and it splits out. So you can use that working against the grain to your advantage as well. For doing the finer steps here, what I'll be doing is just powering the tool by hand. We're getting down to the point where if I keep doing this with a mallet, I'm going to be taking off bigger chunks than I want. And with a loon, they have a shape that's a little bit different than a duck. A duck tends to be pretty high along here, whereas with a loon, you've got 2 large patches, and I'm just sort of working down the valley between them. Then they have a large shoulder patch called the scapulars, which comes around here, and then the flight feathers are more visible. With a duck, these shapes are just a little bit different. I think the moral of the story is when you're working on a decoy size, whether it's a loon or a mallard or some other type of wildfowl, make sure that you know your anatomy of the particular bird, because they're all just a little bit different. And it's not the details or the colors or the paint that determines what that bird looks like. It's the general shape. Now when I'm using the gouges here, what I'm doing is I'm bracing my hand against the wood. So I always have a steady point of reference. I'm not just kind of flopping around with my hands in different directions. I'm keeping my pushing hand tucked in close to my elbow, my other hand braced against here, and then your weight just kind of braced forward, so you can kind of just go with the flow of it. You always have to spend time redrawing your lines on here. I always draw some reference marks when I'm working, and then as you go along they get carved away. And then you just redraw them, and it's always a process of continually redrawing your lines. Doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of a little rough outline so you know where you're going with this guy. Now this will be the scapulars. This is a line we drew in earlier, and the primary flight feathers will come down here like so. Let me just turn this guy a bit. For outlining these feather areas, I'm going to be using a V-gouge. This is a fairly large V-gouge, much larger than used for a general whittling project. But for these, it makes a great tool for roughing out the shapes. Loons are one of my favorite water birds. They're a very primitive bird. The species has been around for millions and millions of years. They're older than the whales or any of the other mammals. And even old for a bird. I mean, it's much older species than the duck. I drew up my patterns for this loon by going back to a pond out behind my cabin, and there was a pair of loons nesting back there. They're not very good on land. Their feet set very far back on their body, so they can't really walk on land very well. So they'll build their nest right on the edge of the water. Anyway, I don't know where this nest was, but I knew that there was a nesting pair around, and they would come around this pond in a circular motion feeding, and they had a regular route. So what I did was I went out there with my binoculars and a telescope early in the afternoon, and then I just let them swim down to where I was, and they didn't see me back behind these bushes. It was really kind of a nice experience. They had one little chick. They usually have between 1 and 2 eggs, and some of them survive, some of them get eaten by turtles and whatnot. But what the loons will do is they'll let the little ones climb up on their back and swim around like that. As the birds get older, if there's danger or something, then the little ones will get up on their back and the parents will swim them off away from danger. This particular day, there wasn't anything dangerous going on, but this little loon wanted to ride anyway. And I guess his mother thought that wasn't necessary. And loons are different than ducks because they're much heavier boned. And a duck has to sort of dive head first into the water. A loon can just sort of let air out and sink like a submarine. So, this mother loon thought the little one didn't need to be there, and it just submerged right out from under him, left him bobbing around in the water. Then came back a few minutes later with a small fish. They're really interesting birds. I think it's the one bird that really symbolizes the sort of spirit of the North Woods. They have a very strange laughter. It's sort of like a laughing yodel. Okay, I think you can see here how we get the shape of these wings. And I'll just shape around the scapulars here. This tool I've been using is a number 2 30 millimeter gouge, and it's very flat. It's almost flat like a chisel. You'll find that as you get these surfaces going smoother and smoother, you'll be using a flatter and flatter tool to smooth them, particularly along these primary feathers here. We'll want this very smooth for the detailing that we're going to be doing next. Let me just show you where this is going to lead up to. When you get those smoothed down, you can start drawing on the feather lines here. Once again, it's important to know the anatomy of the particular bird that you're working with. For example, on these loons, here's the scapular area we showed you about, and that's sort of the shoulder patch of the bird. Then we have the secondaries, and this is this line of feathers that comes along here. And these are the ones that are on the inside of the wing. Then we come to the primary flight feathers, and there's usually 10 of those primaries on each bird for each wing. And we draw in the lines for where these feathers are going to lie. The way they fall on the bird's back here are kind of like shingles on the house, and the closest one in is always on top, and then they kind of layer underneath that. To detail this feather, just take a small V-gouge, or like the 6 millimeter number 12 here, and just take and make a very thin line. Don't go very deep on this. Keep it shallow. And we'll make another one here. Then take a small flat gouge, like the small number 2, and just very carefully pare away the wood under that. Same thing here. And that gives you that step-down look, the layered appearance, as though one feather was overlapping the other. Then you just do that for the tail feathers and for the other side, and you've got the feathers all carved. For some added detail, you might want to take and burn these feathers in. Let me show you how we do that. I'm using a wood burning pen here. And this is what a lot of wildlife carvers are using these days for texturing feathers. This is a control box, and it has a little rheostat here that determines the degree of heat that you're going to be using. It has an on and off switch. And you can get a very delicate control to the amount of heat that you're using. That puts its degree of electricity through this cord and heats up the tip here. To texture these feathers, you just take and very carefully draw little lines that represent the individual barbs of the feather. A delicate heat control is important because some parts of the wood are going to require more heat than others. Then it's just a simple matter of taking your head, gluing them on the bird. Now you can use the same glue we use to glue up our block with, or you can take some epoxy glue and stick it on. You'll find that this glue actually soaks into the wood and seals it very hard, makes a harder joint than the wood itself. I've seen cases where a bird has had the head glued on like this, it's been dropped, and it'll break someplace else other than where the glue joint is. The glue is actually harder than the wood. When this is all glued on solid, put them back in the vise with a block and take a large tool like a number 2 or number 3 and then just bevel around there and smooth that down. For doing the final smoothing, you might want to take something like a rasp. And this is a 4-in-hand rasp. It's got a smooth side here and a coarse side here. And you can take that and then just smooth around here. The neck on a loon is very smooth. The feathers are very smooth and they don't show even when you're quite close to them. When you get done, you'll have something that looks like this. And this is our finished loon. The eyes are glass, and this is what they look like before you put them in. And I paint the backs of them the color of the iris of the particular bird. Loons are kind of neat because the eyes are red, and it gives them kind of a strange look. For painting, the loon is very simple, just black and white. That's all you really need. What I find works the best is to take and paint the black on first, then take a little of the white and overlap it into these areas. If you're careful with how you use the brush, you can get sort of a dry brushing effect that looks like feathers. And I can show you a little more about that in just a second. These white areas here are actually put on first, and then the black lines are drawn on to them using a very fine brush. Well, like a number 1. And just take a black paint and draw these little lines on them. These lines on the neck are very distinctive, and people who have studied loons for a long time can actually distinguish one loon from the other by these lines on the neck. They're like fingerprints. For doing the white spots, once again you take your brush here and then just paint the white spots on. Now for doing these large spots on the back, I'm going to show you a little trick. The paint that works best for the loons is an acrylic. I use a black acrylic and a white. Take a little dab of paint, put it in a saucer, and then just thin it with a little tad of water. if you get the right consistency of paint on your brush, just halfway between being wet and being too dry, you'll get to a certain point where there's just enough paint to barely hold the bristles together. And you can take a piece of cardboard and test your brush on here. And when you get to the right effect, instead of laying down a glob of paint, it'll lay down very fine lines that look just like feathers. Practice a little bit on a piece of a scrap of dark cardboard or something. Then when you've got it, go over to your loon and just brush on these spots. And that gives a feathered effect without making the spots look too garish. You have kind of a nice, soft, feathered look. And that's really all there is to it. It's a real fun project, and it's one that when you get done, you really know you've got quite a carving. Next time we get together, I'd like to show you how to carve a small horse. And once again, we'll be going back to our whittling tools. And this wood, I'm going to use as butternut this time. So thanks for dropping by, and until next week, this is Rick Butz wishing you happy carving.
You can continue to learn wood carving with Rick Butz with his book, How to Carve Wood. This 224-page book of challenging exercises and projects is full of detailed instructions. Lessons include whittling, wildlife carving, and relief carving. To order your copy, call 1-800-950-9648.
Woodcraft, for all your woodworking needs. Tools, supplies, lumber, project plans, and educational workshops. With a mail-order catalog and stores nationwide. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.